Hello there everybody, Sam's Trains here and welcome back to the railway. Today I'm dedicating an entire video to Atlantic locomotives. For a really long time, I would always say that my favourite steam wheel configuration was the 440, and I still like the 440. I think it has a really nicely proportioned look to it. But more recently, I think another wheel configuration has overtaken the 440 for me, and that is the Atlantic, which is strange because there's not that many Atlantics around, particularly not in model form. But hey, I'm a strange person, so what can you expect? Of course, the Atlantic is pretty much the same thing as a 440, it's just got an extra pair of non-driven wheels at the back, and I think that extra couple of wheels at the back makes a massive difference. It completely changes the look of the loco. So today I thought I would show you some of the Atlantics that are available in model form. We're going to talk about those, kind of worship those a little bit, and then I'm going to mention a couple of other Atlantics that I really like that haven't been made available in model form, and perhaps I'd like to see them one day. But first we'll start off with the oldest Atlantic I have in the collection. Oldest in terms of the real life prototype, not in terms of the model, although it is also the oldest model, I think. Very interesting. And that is this. This is the Great Northern's C1 Atlantic, and I think this is possibly the better known of the Atlantics as well. And it's because of this loco that I'm making this video, because recently I re-reviewed this engine and it reminded me just how much I love Atlantics, and I thought, you know, I want to do a full video on it. So yeah, this is the larger boiler C1. There also existed a smaller boilered C1, which, looking at the photos, I think actually looks a little bit cuter than this, certainly less conventional, so I'd love to see Bachmann do that one day. But in terms of the C1s, all they've actually done so far is the C1 with the larger boiler. But it is a beautiful, beautiful model thanks to its livery. The C1 in real life was introduced just after the turn of the 20th century in 1902, and it was a fleet of 94 Atlantics built to the design of Henry Ivatt. When new, these were used to haul the heaviest and fastest passenger express trains that the Great Northern had to offer, and they could do so at speeds of up to 90 miles per hour. Following the grouping of 1923, the C1s became part of the L&ER, where they were split up into the C1 and C2 classes, depending on their boiler sizes. By this point, though, they were no longer the most powerful locomotives on the railway, so they were relegated to lighter express work. Withdrawal began in the mid-1940s, and the final example was withdrawn in 1950. Today, only two C1 Atlantics remain under preservation, one with the large boiler and one with the small. And I've been thinking about this, and I think I've managed to nail what it is that I really enjoy about the C1. And I think there's a bit of a contrast going on here. Obviously, the livery is extremely pretty. Lovely colours, loads of lining, makes the loco look really elegant. But I think if you actually look at the loco itself and try to ignore the livery, it's actually not that much of a pretty thing. There's lots of harsh angles and right angles in the design. If you look at the running plate, it's very straight, and the cab here is very boxy looking. The way the roof is kind of just part of the cab walls and it's just flush to the front face of the cab makes it look very, very business-like. And I think that hints at the fact that this was a very serious machine with a job to do. It was business-like, it wasn't just here to look pretty. And that does contrast with the livery, I think, which is obviously meant to spruce it up and make it look a little bit more palatable. So yeah, a very, very interesting loco, I think, and it is the liveries on these Atlantics, partially, which makes me like them so much as well. I mean, this is just done beautifully. And it looks even better when it's running. I think that is very true. So with that, let's get this down onto the track and let's have it haul another train. So I do actually have the little 4 and 6 wheeler Great Northern coaches, but I thought just for a change I would run some of the larger L&ER teaks, because I always run the smaller 4 and 6 wheelers. And of course, while she would have been hauling smaller coaches like that in her early days, because the C1 survived a little bit longer than that into L&ER ownership, they would have been hauling the larger teaks. Anyway, And after all, these locos by Bachmann are pretty heavy and powerful, so I thought why not hook this up to a slightly bigger train and really see what she can do. And as you can see, hauling these teaks here with absolute ease. So a beautiful runner, really cool engine. Let's move on. So now we're going to move on to the next Atlantic I have in the collection, and this is possibly my favourite one. It's also made by Bachmann, as pretty much all of them are, but it is a little different. It is this, the H1 Atlantic, which I believe was heavily based on the C1, but with some changes. And of course, the livery here makes it look entirely different from the C1. So this is the LBSC Umber, which was a pre-grouping livery seen on a lot of LBSC locomotives. And it's this kind of unusual brown, which I always find fascinating because you wouldn't think that brown would work on a locomotive. But for some reason, on all these pre-grouping locos, brown with this kind of gold lining does work. It just looks great, I think. And so that's another reason why I really enjoy the H1. The H1 was a much smaller class of just 5 locomotives built between 1905 and 1906. Designed by D.E. Marsh, the class was intended for express passenger work, although most of the design was borrowed from the C1 Atlantics, with just a few technical changes. The most major being a higher boiler pressure of 200 psi. The resulting locomotives looked much different to the Atlantics of the Great Northern though, thanks to their different bodywork and of course the excellent LBSC Umber liveries that I've mentioned, which couldn't be more different from the Great Northern Greens, could they? Like the Great Northern Atlantics though, the H1 proved to be a great success, and they were easily able to haul the LBSC's luxury Pullman services. This example, La France, was possibly the grandest of the bunch, and it was often used to haul royal trains or other important services, hence the white painted roof. They actually survived for many years in operation, passing into Southern Railway ownership from 1923, and 3 of the 5 H1s even survived into British Railways ownership following nationalisation in 1948. Here they survived for just a handful of years until 1951, when they were finally withdrawn and scrapped. Today, no examples remain under preservation. And I do think the LBSC Atlantics, while being so similar to the C1, are a little bit more elegant, a little bit prettier looking. Look, the lines are not quite as harsh on this one. We've got more curves, and the cab in particular looks a lot more elegant, doesn't it? We've got the curves on the roof, the front end of the cab looks a little bit less boxy. Yeah, I think this has got the livery and the elegant loco to go along with it. Absolutely beautiful, and the livery is something that Bachmann just nailed on this thing. I mean, look at the complexity of the banding here, absolutely crazy. Look at the crest on the splashes as well. I mean, if you think about some of those Helgen locos that I've reviewed recently, they can't quite get the crests as good as this, can they? And this loco is 5 years old or so now, and yet it just looks so good up close. So I think this one could be my favourite of the Atlantics, thinking about it, because it's got the gorgeous livery and it's also got the sort of elegant loco to go along with it. The other strange thing, of course, is the top of the tender, which is orange. What is all that about? It is a bit of an LBSC thing, this. I think, what was it, Gladstone has a similar sort of orange finish to the inside of the tender. Never understood why they did that, not sure. It doesn't really match the loco, but you know, I do kind of like it. But anyway, let's hook this up to some coaches and let's see her run. So I'm staying with the spirit of running slightly different coaches to what I usually would with these Atlantics. And with the H1 here, I'd usually run those gorgeous birdcage coaches in the LBSC Umber, thus making up my favourite train. And if you want to see that, I'll pop a link to that video up in the top right. That's the review I did of this loco when I did run it with those coaches. But again, these would have hauled the smaller 4-wheel coaches back in the early days. So that's what I've got running with the H1 now. And actually, I wish I had a few more of these. Can you imagine like a rake of 12 of these LBSC coaches behind the H1? Now that would be amazing. I might do that one day, because 3, when they're small like this, doesn't look the best. But you can get the idea anyway. And of course, this H1 from Bachmann is yet another absolutely lovely runner. So now we're going to move on to the last and most modern of the Bachmann Atlantics that I've got, and that is this, the H2 Atlantic, which was based quite heavily on the H1, but it was introduced a bit later on and with some upgrades. As you can see, this is in the Southern Railway green, although these still were pre-grouping locos. They weren't so late as to have been introduced post-grouping, and I believe Bachmann did produce the H2 like this in the Umber livery, which I don't have, but I think they did do it. But yeah, I think this looks a lot more modern in the Southern livery, doesn't it? And again, practically the same thing as the H1, but it looks a lot different because of the change in livery. The H2 Atlantic was also designed by D.E. Marsh, but it was finished off by L.B. Billington, and this came just 6 years after the H1 Atlantic. The H1 and H2 were extremely similar, with the H2 being essentially the same design but with a few changes. They had new superheated boilers and also a lower boiler pressure of 170 psi. The superheated boiler was so successful that the H1s were eventually fitted with this as well, and apparently after the superheating modifications, the H1s arguably ran better than the H2s did, which is quite interesting. Electrification on the Southern Railway meant that little work was left for the H2s in the end, and although they did manage to survive doing lighter duties for many years, the first withdrawal eventually took place pretty early in 1949, and by 1958 every example had been withdrawn and scrapped with no survivors. Although one new build has been created though, so if you want to, you can still see an H2 out there in the wild. And I also find the H2 absolutely fascinating because of course it looks entirely different, I think, from the H1. But would you believe they are almost exactly identical? Here's the H2 and here's the H1. Very, very little difference. In fact, it's taken me ages to actually find a difference between these two. Now, the difference is the running plate. As you can see, this has got a riveted running plate and the H1 hasn't. That's the only real difference I've spotted personally. If you can see anything else, and these sort of comparative shots should help you, please do comment down below and let me know. But don't you think it's amazing what a change of livery can do? I think this is possibly the best example of that because, yeah, I really think this looks totally different. And I do love the Southern greens. The green with the white lining always looks gorgeous, and this is just a great example of that because we've got all the lining around the underframe as well, and the tenders fully lined too. Yeah, it's absolutely beautiful. Not quite on the same level as the LBSC Umber and the Great Northern Green, but still absolutely beautiful, isn't it? And again, that wheel configuration, that 442 wheel configuration under it all, just adds to the elegance, I think. So there you have it, the H2. Let's get this down onto the track and give it a run. And here she comes now with a small rake of Southern coaches, full-size coaches. A little bit of a slowdown around the curves there. Yeah, looking lovely. And of course, this is the only one of the Atlantics I've showed you so far that it's actually possible to ride, thanks to that replica being built. There's no H1 in existence, and the C1s in real life I don't think are in running order. Do correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, not something I've ever done. Never had a ride behind the H2, but I would love to. I'd love to see it in steam. What a beautiful, beautiful engine it is. So yeah, lovely runner once again. Let's move on and talk about something a little bit different. So that's it for the Bachmann Atlantics, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about the background of those models because there's something that I want to find out about these that I've always wondered about. So the C1 was the first released by Bachmann. That came out in 2015, I believe, and at that time it was exclusive to the National Railway Museum. Then in 2019, Bachmann re-released the C1 as a general release, and they also released the H1 and the H2 alongside it. So that makes me wonder, do these locos share the same chassis? It seems very strange that Bachmann would release 3 Atlantics at the same time. If they had to redevelop the chassis for 3 different locos, you know, do it 3 times, that would have cost them a lot of money. So I've always wondered, does the C1 and the H1, for example, share the same chassis? Well, I'm going to take the bodies off both and compare them. Not something I've ever done before, but I really want to find out. Okay, let me see about whipping the body off this C1 then, which is a pain because there is a hole in the front of the bogie here to get a screwdriver through, but it's not big enough. I don't really have a screwdriver that is really adequate to go through that little hole. And of course, even if you do, the screw won't fit through the hole afterwards, so you risk losing it. So front bogie off, And the weird thing about the H1 is that the hole in that bogie is bigger, so the bogies are different, but I'm interested in the main chassis, so let's get this off. Okay, so there's that. Let's put that to one side. Now the H1 chassis. And look at this, bigger hole in the front bogie, so you can slide a screwdriver through, and I'm thinking the screw will fit through the hole as well. Yeah, it does. Body mountings though, the same. We've got the one at the front there, and then the two under the back of the cab. So that supports my theory that they are the same, but are they identical or are they just similar? Let's see. Let's put them next to each other. If I can get this one out. Yeah, it's coming. There we go. And there's your answer. The answer is no, they are not the same. I always heard that they were. I always thought and assumed that they were, but no, they're totally not. I'm lining them both up at the back, and you can see the H1's front driving wheels are quite a way in front of the C1's, and the H1's chassis is a little bit longer too. The cylinders are further forward than on the C1. So when Bachmann released their H1 and H2, it was a completely new model. It doesn't appear to share any of the same chassis components as far as I can see. I've got a different design here as well, where the C1's axle here is exposed, because I think they intended originally to make that front axle driven as well as the rear one. No such intention with this. This is the newer loco. By this point they probably realised they didn't need to do that. So yeah, totally not what I was expecting. How interesting is that? The next question I've got about Atlantics is an Atlantic only an Atlantic when it's a tender engine? In other words, do tank engines count? Well, I don't see why not, so in that case I do have another Atlantic to show, and that is this. It is the Adams Radial tank, produced by Oxford Rail in this case, although Hornby did produce one as well. I don't think this really looks like an Atlantic. I've never thought of it as an Atlantic, if that makes sense. It just doesn't look anything like the tender engine Atlantics. But sure enough, it does have the 442 wheel configuration, so I suppose technically that does make this an Atlantic. And these locos in real life were designed by William Adams, and they were first built all the way back in 1882, which makes them even earlier than the C1. And sure enough, the 442 Atlantic wheel configuration was pretty unusual for a tank engine. Also known as the 415 class, the engines hauled suburban passenger services on the LSWR and the Southern Railway later on, and later on even than that under British Railways, although most of the class were scrapped shortly after the First World War. 71 were produced in total between 1882 and 1885, but only a few of these actually passed into Southern Railway ownership. Most were gone before 1930, having been replaced with more modern designs, the Drummond M7 tank engines being a good example. And obviously the Adams Radial tank here is a smaller engine than the tender engines that I've been showing you, but the wheelbase is actually larger. Yeah, this is longer than the tender engines, and I think that's because the wheels are sort of spread out a little bit more, particularly the drivers. Massive gaps between the drivers there, and also a massive gap between the rear pony wheel and the rear driver. Yeah, I don't think this looks as nice somehow. I do love the Adams Radial tank, and it's still an Atlantic, so I do enjoy it, but I don't think the wheel configuration somehow looks quite as good on this one. I think because of the large gaps. If the driving wheels were a bit larger, I think it might look nicer. But yeah, it's just interesting to note how different this looks as a tank engine with a more stretched out wheelbase. But still, a beautiful, beautiful loco. Again, the livery looks gorgeous on this. And I also find it interesting how far back the smoke box door is from the buffer beam at the front there. Look at that. I don't think I know another engine with such a massive gap at the front like that, but again, I think that gives this a very unique look. So an enjoyable loco, this one. Not such a good runner on the track, unfortunately. I've always had trouble with these, but I'm going to give this a run for you, and hopefully this is going to perform well enough so that it can haul a couple of coaches. Well, to be fair to her, she seems to be running a lot better than I remember her doing. So did I replace the motor in this? It's quite bad, but I can't remember. Can't remember what I've done and what I've not, but that does seem to be running extremely well, though I can't remember. So I haven't loaded her up with too many coaches, just a couple of the 6-wheelers, Hornby ones though, so they're not that easy to haul. just to give an idea of what this looked like running. And of course, with these small sort of suburban passenger runs, these wouldn't have been hauling massive trains, although 2 coaches is obviously a little bit light, but even so, nice to see the Adams radial tank running again, and you can imagine this running with a few more, I'm sure. But there we go, there we have it, the Adams radial tank. Let's move on. So that's all the Atlantics I have in the collection, I think. I could have missed some, I don't think so though. But of course these were not the only Atlantics to ever exist, and over here in the UK there was a few others. I'm going to give a few honourable mentions here because I've found a few that have really piqued my interest. So here's one that I really like the look of. This is known as the North British H-Class, and 22 of these engines were built to the design of William Reed for the North British Railway. Now the livery looks a lot like the LBSC Umber, which I like, although it is subtly different. And interestingly, these eventually became part of the LNER instead of the Southern Railway as the LBSC Atlantics did. So I'd be interested to see what this looks like in LNER livery, although I can't find out that much about them. As you can see, this was a massively beefy Atlantic, and it looks like it should really have more driving wheels than it does. Much bigger than the Atlantics I've shown today, I suspect as well. But there is one more Atlantic that I want to mention, and when I saw this thing I thought, oh my goodness, what is that? So I'm going to show it to you, and here it is. So I have mostly focused on British Atlantics today, but this one is in the Tennessee Central Railroad livery from 1915, I believe, and it was built by Kerr Stuart, who was based in Stoke-on-Trent. So does that mean that this engine was built in the UK? I don't know, look at it, it does look kind of British, doesn't it? I realise I'm asking more questions than I'm answering here because I can't find out any more info on this thing, other than it may have originally been built to run in China, but China or America, it's still interesting that such a British looking loco ran overseas like that. And I think there are some telltale signs that it wasn't built for British railways. As you can see, it's got the cowcatcher and also the large bogie tender, which back in 1915 probably wouldn't have been necessary for the UK. But there you have it, that's all I've got on Atlantics. I hope you enjoyed that. Please do comment down below and let me know what your favourite Atlantics are. Are there other British Atlantics that you'd like to see produced in model form? And has your favourite been produced already, or is it something you're still waiting for? But thank you again for watching, you have a great day, and I'll catch you on the next video. Alright, cheers folks, you take care.